So Matt, I appreciate you hopping on here and talking with me. And as I said before we jumped on, saw your thread of tweets, and a number of people saw them, and it really brought a lot of attention to this whole rev share and the house case and all the things that are happening with that. And obviously, you're uniquely qualified to speak on those things because you went from being a coach to being in administration for a number of years, and now back to being a coach. So you see it through both lenses and how things need to go. You're kind of a one man checks and balances at this point, right? So definitely wanted to jump into that, but I wanted to start out and ask you, how have things been being back in the coaching chair? You won a number of titles, then you went into coaching after a little bit of a freestyle career, and
Mhm.
then we were at Columbia as well as Penn. Now you're back to coaching after being an admin. How's the transition been at Penn with you now, stepping back into the room?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. Honestly, it's been a blast being back on the mat and being back with the guys. And, a lot of people ask me, why the move? Why be in a position that you're in with admin, where you're kind of moving up the ranks and doing pretty well, and all of a sudden you're coming back to coaching? And I think at the end of the day, what it boiled down to for me was I miss the interpersonal relationships that you build through the sport and directly impacting people, right? And being able to help guys. The mat is a big piece of it for sure because we're coaches, right? We want to win wrestling matches, but that's not the be all end all at the end of the day. And for me, it's about helping young men who are on our program, in our program, develop into better people, right? And hopefully they win wrestling matches along the way, but whether they do or they don't, they go off into the world and have an impact in a positive way. And the role that I was in, I love my time in the administration. The further up in administration I moved, the further away from the athletes I moved.
Mhm.
And, it was that direct impact piece that I really missed. From a wrestling perspective, I would say it's a little bit like riding a bike for me from a coaching perspective, right? It's a little wobbly at first in the first few months. Nah, I shouldn't even say months. First few weeks, I was like, all right, I do remember how to do this, right? And then, now that we're a couple months in, I'm like, all right, I'm feeling good about where we are. And credit to our team and our guys and our staff and our admin here at Penn. I mean, they've been incredibly supportive across the board. And the guys, I appreciate them coming at this with open mind and open heart. And um, I think they're doing some incredible stuff. And I'm excited to see what we can do in the next few weeks when we get out on the mat.
Yeah, and you're fortunate to be around a guy like Roger Reina who you can learn from. Obviously, coaching and recruiting and a lot of that stuff is very different than when you were in the coaching chair before. But then you also have a guy like Jordan Burroughs that's training in the room, and then obviously Coach Slay and and Joey McKenna. These guys that are in the room that
Mhm.
have been part of the game for so long, as you've been, a degree away, right? For such a long time. How has that been, just learning from guys that are at the pinnacle of the sport? And how has that, transition for you made it a little bit easier because these guys are like, hey, these are the things that are different. They're able to kind of give you a cheat sheet with the new generation of wrestlers that are coming into Penn.
Mhm. No, honestly, it's been incredible for me, and I'm so fortunate to be in this position that I'm in right now. This transition of kind of how things are progressing from a coaching perspective of me taking over in the future. You couldn't plan this any better, right? Typically, when a new coach comes in, a couple things have to happen. One, you probably need to reset a culture, right? When there's a coaching change, most of the time it's for a reason, right? So you either have to change a culture or you have to help a team understand what a high level program needs to operate like, or you need to rally an alumni community to get behind a program to be able to do more. I'm walking in a situation where all of those things are taken care of, right? We've
Mhm.
got one of the greatest coaches, arguably in NCAA history, right? And Coach Reina, but definitely in Penn history, who has built an absolute juggernaut of a program through the years. Our alumni are all bought in. They're all in on this program, right? We got incredibly exciting things happening here at Penn from that perspective. And then I turn around and I got Jordan Burroughs standing behind me, training, beating up on our upper weights. And I'm like, all right, high level wrestling. Well, we got that covered too, right? And then culturally, you're bringing in people like Jordan and Joey and the coaching staff that we have and Doug Zaff. And now we got Darian Cruz in the mix. And I'm like, well, okay, so this is like the easiest transition I'll ever get to be a part of in my life because all of the pieces that you typically would need to reset, right, to get a program back on track, we had those things in place. And my job right now is it's a little bit of don't screw things up and a little bit of like, how can I help elevate in little places here and there to help this program break through to the next level? So I consider myself incredibly fortunate that I'm walking into this situation. And then we have a team that is willing to buy in and support that too. And it's an incredibly exciting time for us to have this group of people, Slay and Jordan and Joey and JLO and our whole staff here at Penn. I mean, they are a group that are all on the same page, pushing the same direction, excited about the big things that are ahead.
You mentioned Darian Cruz, and I was fortunate enough to literally see him throughout his whole career, being from the Lehigh Valley and covering him, with the newspaper when I was there, and then obviously throughout my entire journalism career. What has he brought to Penn so far with just being there for a short amount of time?
Mhm. So obviously the things that you would expect, right? He's an extremely high level wrestler. He knows how to compete. He's had success at a high level. He immediately walks in with clout, the moment he walks in the door. It's the intangible things that you don't see that I think are the biggest impact. Like he has jumped head first into building relationships with our team. He's out, spending time with our guys all the time, getting to know them as people, not just as wrestlers. He's willing to commit the time, put extra time in to help support our guys whenever he can. And he's an incredible technician too, right? And then you bring in the recruiting piece, a guy who technically hadn't been involved in the recruiting side of things before. I give Darian a world of credit. He jumped right in and he's crushing it on the recruiting front. So we're lucky to have a guy like that on staff. I would argue I would put our staff up against any in the country at this point. And I think how we work together is one of the key pieces of kind of how this staff has elevated itself. And Darian's a huge piece of that puzzle.
Yeah. So I mentioned, you mentioned recruiting, and I talked about how recruiting has now changed. And I want to jump to, the reason I reached out to you is you put out this thread about how the House versus NCAA case is going to very much so hurt Olympic sports. And, we've been talking about it on, the Intermat podcast for a little bit of how this transition is going to happen. But I'm going to kind of give you the floor. What were some of your initial thoughts when you saw these things? And like I said, you're kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to this because you've seen the perspective from an admin and as well from a coaching standpoint. So when you saw the kind of the line items and the boxes that they were looking to check with new roster limits and rev share, what was your mind? How did you wrap your mind around it, and what were your initial thoughts?
Mhm. No, I appreciate the segue on that. And obviously being in the role I was in formerly on the admin side of things, was tracking on this. I have been tracking on this for a really long time, right? We've
Mhm.
we've been keeping an eye on many of these lawsuits that have been ongoing with the NCAA. And the NIL breakthrough a couple of years ago, I think was a really positive step. But the House lawsuit was always one that we always had an eye on of like, this is the one that could really impact the landscape in a major way. And we're not sure how. And now we're starting to get a little bit of insight into what that's going to look like. What's interesting is, there still could be plenty of changes between now and when they implement everything. But the core of this House lawsuit, ironically, it's a men's swimmer whose name is on the lawsuit, um, is that athletes are suing for a piece of the pie, right?
Mhm.
They want revenue coming back to the athletes. Which on the surface, I think in concept probably makes sense when you look at the money that goes into the NCAA from, primarily men and women's basketball and football. You look at that and the TV contracts and the revenue, and you're like, all right, the kids should get a cut of this. What people sometimes don't understand is that athletic departments, for the most part, don't operate in the black, right? We collectively across the board, outside of I think it's up to like 5 or 6 athletic departments at this point, actually make money in any given year, right? So now you got thousands of other schools that are actually operating in the red and they're losing money every year, and the school has to backdrop all of that. And that's including the revenue that's coming in, right? And we've had all this conference shifting and schools moving in different places, and the landscape has been shifting significantly over the last few years. But if you look at this House case and what it's starting to look like now is something that brings some incredible unknowns to the table, but unknowns that are pretty scary because the bottom line is, and I'll put my former administrator hat on for a second on this one. No administrator wants to be in a situation where they have to choose this program over that one,
Mhm.
right? And obviously you got your big time sports, your flagship sports, and what they are, and they're going to be treated like they get treated. But there are a lot of sports that don't necessarily bring a financial benefit to an athletic department, but bring a whole lot to the table. Now we're talking about a true pie that has to be sliced up in a way that's technically going to be supporting more to the bigger ones. And then what the heck do you do with the other ones, right? Um, and what does that impact mean? What does that look like? Well, it is starting to take shape a little bit. We're seeing these scholarship limits come into place. There's this conversation about salary cap, right? What does that look like? Does that include NIL? Does it not? My gut is it probably won't include NIL. I think that's probably an antitrust violation that they won't be able to get past.
Mhm.
Um, but roster limits, scholarship situations, I think those are very real. Those are going into place next year. And we know with pretty solid certainty at this point that the Power Four conferences are going to be opting into this, right? So you've got four conferences, the SEC, the ACC, the Big 12, and the Big 10, that have this rev share concept that they know they're going to have to walk into. They have these roster limits that they're going to have to walk into, and potentially a salary cap across all sports. Now the real questions start being asked. Does a school like Ohio State that has, almost 40 sports, how are they going to handle this, right? There's only so much revenue to go around. You can only feed so many people. And, what does that shake out like? And then you add the overlay of like, we still have a Title IX issue we've got to navigate here too, right? You got to support women's sports. It's the right thing to do. Um, but at some point that money has limits and you can only go so far.
Yeah.
Uh, so we're walking into this time where we know pieces of this are going to go into place. We don't necessarily know all the details yet. But if coaches in Olympic sports are not actively thinking about this right now, it's really time for you to get your head out of the sand and start thinking about it.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, there's only about a handful. I think there's like, I'm in Austin, Texas. So University of Austin, UT is a school that's definitely one of those schools. Bama, you name your big football schools, those are
Mhm.
usually the ones that are going to be doing this. And the article that went around where a lot of people were reading it, and a lot of people were commenting on it. I think the Alabama AD was quoted in that saying, they have a number of sports and there's about $40 million that goes from the revenue generating sports to subsidize the other. And,
Mhm.
something that I picked up on, and I think it might have been a comment on your thread, was, the words revenue generating get thrown around a lot, but that does not always equal profit, right? Revenue generating just means that money is coming in, doesn't mean that it is keeping, putting us in the green, essentially, as you would say. So that's like the most interesting thing to me is a lot of these different things that are going to be changing, and they're supposed to be changing for the better, are really going to hurt a lot of athletes, where a lot of these cuts are coming. Football going up to 105, men's gymnastics at Ohio State already losing those scholarships. So how would you as an administrator, you as a coach, how would you speak to your coaches and say, this is what's coming, here's how we have to recruit with this type of new stipulation?
Mhm. It's a great question. Somewhat ironically, and funny, I found myself like questioning, do I even put this out there? So we started this conversation from a recruiting perspective. As an Ivy school, we're non-scholarship.
Mhm.
We're need-based financial aid only. We're not going to opt into house. There's no rev share piece for us that we're concerned about, right? So collectively as a league, I don't foresee us getting involved in this. And I actually think that works to our benefit,
Yeah.
right? Like the Ivy League collectively is nationally competitive at this point in wrestling. And from a wrestling perspective, I'm like, all right, I'll take numbers 31 through 36 at some of these top Big Ten ACC programs, right? Like those are studs that are going to get squeezed out of a roster. And like I can take 36, 37, 38, whatever. I'll take those guys and we'll develop them into stars and we'll go toe to toe with the big kids. Um, so from a recruiting perspective, I'm kind of like, well, I'm not too concerned about it. We're keeping an eye on it, but we don't foresee the same level of impact that some of these other schools will, for
Mhm.
sure. Um, if I'm an administrator right now, I'm probably crunching numbers and trying to figure out, like, if we're opting into this model, well, all right, finite resources, where are we going to put them, and how do we make our teams competitive within this new model that's coming, right? There are going to be a whole ton of schools that are convinced they're going to try and hang around this football and basketball model and be competitive, right? It's the same thing we've always seen, except now it's just going to be more money going into those programs, right? Um, that may be an AD's choice to do that, but most times that probably stems from university at large, right? That like, no, you got to figure out how you compete here. Then there's going to be that next tier of schools that are like, well, how do we stay competitive in this environment? What do we do? Do we go to 105 football scholarships? Do we not? How do we navigate this, right? Just because you opt in doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be at that number of scholarships, right? Some people think like, all right, yeah, 30 scholarships for wrestling. Everybody's going to get 30 scholarships, right? Scott Green was joking about that. I was like, yeah, yeah, I think collectively the majority of our community is like, yeah, great, wrestling gets 30 scholarships.
Hmm.
And the truth is that money's got to come from somewhere. And now we're talking about a salary cap on top of it. Well, not every school is going to fully fund every single scholarship available in every sport. They're going to have to choose how do you do it. So if you're an administrator and you're looking around and you're like, well, we know there's going to be, we'll set a round number on it. We know there's going to be 250 scholarships available for all of our sports, and 105 of those are going to football. We need 105 at least for women's sports. All right, now we're at 210. Well, we got to figure out where the other 40 scholarships go across 10 other sports, 20 other sports, right? And we don't know that that's going to be the number at the end of the day, but that's a major question you have to ask. And in reality, most of the group of five, which is the tier of schools just below the Power Four,
Hmm.
are probably going to try and opt in, and they're not going to have the resources to really compete at the highest level. So they're going to have to figure that out. So you're looking at this puzzle, and you're saying, well, we got to figure out how we do this, and we're going to have to save money in some places if we want to be competitive in some of the big sports. Without adding funding and knowing we have to pay athletes now. And that's not even including what the other big lawsuit that's out there still is around employment.
Hmm.
Well, all of a sudden we got to pay employees. Like you're probably thinking long and hard about the sports you offer, how many sports you're going to offer, who gets scholarships, who doesn't, where your university funding goes, right? And you're going to start probably mapping out a path to like squeeze it into places where you think you're going to have an impact. And uh, that will likely not be Olympic sports at most schools. Some will, right? Some schools who have a really rich tradition of success in Olympic sports may go down that path, but it's going to be at the cost of others. This is a bit of a zero sum situation that we're looking at now.
Yeah. And that's the thing, you mentioned the joking thing from Scott Green, and him and I talk a ton, and we've talked a good bit over the years. But him joking about 30 scholarships, it's really, to people that have been following this, it was funny that he said that, because when this came out, everybody was like, hooray, no more 9.9, or, no more this, no more that at all these schools. The baseline is that you have to opt into these things. And by opting in, yes, we're going to give you a kind of a bigger chunk of this, but you have to sacrifice a lot more to get it. And I
Mhm.
think that's what a lot of people aren't realizing with, just in wrestling, that even though it seems like more, it really isn't. You also have your Olympic sports like track and field, which already hold rosters of about 30 that are dropping to 17, right? So there's a number of different sports that, while it may seem great that we're getting this for wrestling, other sports aren't getting these things, and the things that we feel we're going to be getting for wrestling, we're really truly not. So and like I said, it's an opt-in type of a feature, and as you mentioned, group of five that are going to try and keep up and say that they're opting in. What happens when it doesn't work and it's not sustainable? Are they allowed to opt out? Have you heard anything around that, where it's okay, we're going to try this and we're going to potentially drop scholarships for other sports, or potentially just drop sports altogether, so that we can fund the sports where there's revenue generation? If it doesn't work, maybe we'll go back to the old model. Is that possible? Have you heard anything like that?
I haven't heard anything specific to that yet. What I've mostly heard at this point is that opt in, opt out is primarily going to be at conference level at this
Mm-hmm.
point. And so if you want to stay in a conference, you have to ride with the conference on their decision, right? So group of five school in the, you know, um, Atlantic East, I don't know, we'll pick a random school. It doesn't have wrestling, but they decide they want to opt in because they want to be competitive in basketball. Well, the schools that are even affiliates in other places for wrestling, now that school's opted in because the conference opted in. Now, will they get to a point where schools will individually be able to opt in or opt out? Maybe. I think that's possible. Um, but it would be really interesting to see, mid majors, what do they decide to do, right? You look at some of these schools where their conference is kind of fluctuating, like on the cusp of group of five level, but not quite there. Those are the ones who are going to face some really difficult challenges of like, does that conference then opt in? And if they opt in, what the heck does that mean? Because wrestling doesn't have that conference. They're in an affiliate as it is. And that's not even accounting for schools that don't technically have conferences right now, too, right? So um, it seems like it's going to be likely at conference level, at least initially, and then where does it go from there? I don't know, but um, that'll be a really interesting thing to see how that plays out. And the scariest part of this, honestly, is that it's next year. Like this is
Mhm.
going into place in just a few months, and we have so many questions that are unanswered at this point. And athletic departments are going to have to scramble really quickly to figure out how they get on board with this opt-in, opt-out setup, and what does that look like? I think we have a group of schools that understand they're going to opt out of it, and feel fairly confident about that. Um, but it's going to be a really tricky kind of thing to navigate without a lot of detail behind it too.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Penn isn't one of those schools that, you're looking to opt in. A lot of the Ivies aren't looking to opt in, and a lot of these other schools, I know I've heard other people talk about endowments and things like that. Some of them aren't wrestling specific endowments too.
Mhm.
So the schools that do have wrestling specific endowments, you would think that they would be okay in this regard, but there still isn't a guarantee of that either. So a lot of it, I think as Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, said, it's messy right now, and it's going to continue to get more and more messy throughout this first year when it's coming up. And obviously everything isn't completely signed as of yet, but it's coming, and it's something to certainly be prepared for. And we're in the heart of recruiting season right now for wrestling. And there's already coaches that I've heard say, well, my recruiting pitch now has to change. I don't even know really what it is,
Mhm.
So what's your advice, I guess, to some of your fellow wrestling coaches when it comes to how you can navigate around all the changes that aren't necessarily there yet? And like I said, you have the admin mindset as well as coach mindset. So what would your advice be to some of your fellow coaches who say, I don't even know what to tell a recruit that I'm trying to get to come here?
Mhm. Send your kids to Penn. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I would say you need to be prioritizing this and spending a lot of time in your admin's office asking questions and understanding how they're thinking about it, what they're going about. And then you need to be talking to your alumni. You need to be talking to your supporters in your community. You mentioned the wrestling specific endowment, and we have a history of a program with a significant wrestling endowment that the program still got cut in Notre Dame, right? We know that exists. Um, but wrestling endowment, even at schools that have a significant endowment, if the scholarships themselves aren't endowed and specifically restricted to wrestling, well, that's a little scary too, because they could just, in theory, take those scholarships and push them somewhere else. So you need to
Mhm.
be tracking on how is that written? What does that look like? Do you talk to your donors about, adjusting a gift agreement to make it restricted? But also be talking to your administrators saying, hey, what is our plan? How are we going about this? What are we thinking about? How are we thinking about this? Um, Administrators have been looking at this for a long time, whether they made plans for it, that'll vary school to school. But at this point, they don't have a choice. They need to be preparing for what's coming. I think some schools are starting to put things in motion already. Some are kind of waiting and seeing. But what our coaches cannot do right now, if you're at one of these schools, is sit on your hands and say, well, let's see what happens. Right. Because if you take a wait and see approach right now, and I'm not saying to be aggressive, I'm not saying go yell at people, but like ask questions, be inquisitive, see what you can draw out. Like administrators are talking about this right now because they have to, they don't have a choice. Um,
Is there a lot of like talking amongst administrators, not just within their own schools, but from school to school? Say Penn and Drexel, you guys are right there. Is there talking amongst you guys, or is it more siloed with conferences?
it'll be a little more siloed with conferences. The conversations will likely be at the athletic director level for the most
Mhm.
part, with some trickle down from there. But the other side of all of this, that's kind of a tricky nuance, is like with these types of cases that are antitrust oriented, you have to be delicate in what you say and what you talk about as an administrator who's going to have to implement some of these things too, right? So, you can't discourage athletes. You can't, dig in on many of these things with athletes specifically. Coaches can't talk to athletes about this too much. Like you have to be very careful in how you do it. So you need to be well informed, um, in how you're navigating this with your administration and your guys and be talking to them about like, hey, we don't know. We don't know what this looks like right now. We're going to update you as soon as we can. Coaches can't right now be like, you're not getting any money. Like that's just not going to fly in this world with this lawsuit. So
Mhm.
hopefully your compliance staff, your administrators are talking to you about it. But if you're not already talking to them, you needed to talk to them yesterday and be talking to them every week about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, my hope is that they don't just look to take from the athletes when it comes to doing these things. I heard maybe it was a year ago that Texas A&M, before the lawsuit was even close, was already looking at cutting staff members.
Mhm.
I mean, for me, I'm looking at, when you look at big sports and you see a football coach signs for how many millions, you're like, that's really probably where the money should be coming from, right? You shouldn't be, I understand the high profile jobs that college football, college basketball coaches have, but there is other places than cutting from the athletes that they can get a lot of the millions that are going to be necessary to subsidize these things. But I was talking to a friend of mine. I went to Division III Wilkes University, is where I played football, and we were talking about how this could impact, and I have friends also that coach Division III, how this could impact things when it comes to their recruiting and how it may open up some doors for kids who don't have that Division I possibility anymore. Do you foresee kids saying, okay, well, I can't really be a walk on because that's going, by the wayside, and there's no money for me to go to these schools. Do you see kids start to open up their options to saying, I want to be an athlete on the next level? Division II might be a way to go.
I absolutely see that happening. Uh, with House coming into play, I think that's 100% something we will see happen. I think if programs unfortunately do start going by the wayside, I think we'll see that even more because I do think Division III model in particular probably lends itself to being successful in the house post-house world for sure. Um, I could see that world, the D3 side like having an opportunity to really expand here. And a lot of those Division III schools right now are enrollment driven too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, they'll be excited to bring in a bunch more kids who want to compete at the next level. And I think it'll elevate those programs in a positive way. The other side of all of this that, is actually a pretty significant unknown is like, what does the future of the NCAA look like in general? We've got football in this post-house world talking about super conferences, right? And splitting away. Like if that happens, is there still a Division I, Division II, Division III? Maybe, probably. I don't know. Right. Maybe that is something that doesn't make sense anymore, in sports that are getting decimated or shrunken around the country. Like maybe there's a different division that comes into play. So I think there's a lot of variables that we're looking at ahead of us. Um, and it will be really interesting to see. I mean, you mentioned the administrator side of things and like these coaching salaries, that's something they really don't talk about in all of this too, right? It's like, are we going to put a salary cap limit on coach salaries, right?
Yeah.
These coaches making tens of millions per year, which is pretty wild to coach currently amateur athletes, right? Um, but the flip side of that, and this is part of why we're going to get into this challenge is these athletic departments bring in all this revenue at these big programs, but they also pour so much of that revenue back into the support for the kids that they're bringing in because they have to support these kids that they're bringing in and they have to pay for all of these things now, right? Alabama football, yeah, they bring in all this money, but you realize what they need to do every single year to woo all these superstar recruits that they bring in, right? You look at their locker room, it gets updated every 3 days, I think,
Yeah.
right? And they're just pouring like tens of millions of dollars into it. And, they're feeding these guys like gourmet meals 6 times a day. And, the uptick of what you need to do at this level has really like it's gotten kind of crazy. It's a significant arms race. So, I'm going to shout out to my administrators, former administrators out there. I mean, a lot of my colleagues and friends who work in that world, I think their jobs are at risk right now. To your point of like, people are going to be ADs are going to be looking at ways to try and save money. Schools are looking for ways to save money, and administrators will probably go by the wayside. And I think people underestimate the positive impact those people have on athletes and what the trickle down impact of that'll be. So, it's gonna be fascinating. I could see more schools looking like Division II, Division III programs when it's all said and done, which would in theory be good for Division II and Division III. And I think there could be a path to a wrestling world that kind of re invites D2, D3 back into like the full national picture too, which could be exciting, right? So there's a lot of variables, and I think there's a lot of questions. But I think at this point, like everything is going to end up on the table in the future here.
Yeah, at one point, you did have Division II, Division III wrestlers wrestling in that national tournament. So, say you do have a high caliber guy who wins a national tournament, maybe he does get invited, right? Maybe there is some sort of structure where the NCAA championship system tries to make up for the fact that there's no spots for these guys at a Penn State or, at a Penn or at a Drexel or at any of these schools because of the money allocation or anything like that, right? So, maybe that does restructure things and maybe we do see things change, but I mean in the very near future, the Olympic sports are going to be the ones on the chopping block, which is the craziest thing because there's obviously more of them than there are of the high level sports that everybody loves turning on CBS and watching, but
Mhm.
every 4 years, everybody's tuning in to the Olympics to see how these things go. And these colleges and universities have become the high level feeder programs of our Olympic teams.
Mhm.
And that's where I think the IOC may say, well, hold on, wait a second. If that's going to be the case with one of our biggest money drivers in Team USA, maybe we need to get involved, right? Maybe the governing bodies start to get involved and say, okay, we have to fix this. We have to change this here. We have to change that there. That's just speculation. Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part that hope that the governing bodies get involved, but um, I hope to see something change and change for the better, right? Right now, like I said, Sankey's already saying it's a messy situation. It's going to be messy. But in hopefully at some point things start to get some sort of guardrails. We figure out maybe a collective bargaining, some roster, not just roster caps, but salary caps for coaches and athletes, and just having more structure. Because I think the lack of structure is why we've gotten to this juncture in the first place, and it's
Mhm.
what's going to get us out of it is truly having some structure around it. Matt, I appreciate you coming on and kind of talking through this with me. Do you have any other thoughts or anything you want to share with me and the listeners before I let you go?
Yeah, no, I will just say, as grim as this may sound, it's not all doom and gloom. There's probably some opportunity in here for us as well. What I would encourage anybody and everybody who's interested in understanding more, make sure you're following the news and understand what's going on with this lawsuit and, how these things are going into place, conversations that are kind of happening around it, right? You mentioned the IOC and Olympic sports, right? There are administrators out there, there's commissioners out there already talking about going to the government. Charlie Baker, the president of the NCAA, was talking about like there could be a world where we go to the government finally and say, okay, we're one of the few countries in the world that doesn't fund their Olympic movement. It might be time for the government to get involved. So there are people thinking about Olympic sports, which is a good thing, including the president of the NCAA, if it continues to exist, which I think would be and could be a good thing for Olympic sports specifically. But this is not all doom and gloom. There's going to be opportunity out there for sure. I just would encourage anybody and everybody who's interested to be asking questions of the people who are ultimately going to have to make those decisions at the end of the day. And I will add this, and shout out to Scotty Sentes on this one. If and when changes happen, don't go lighting people up just on a whim, right? I can tell you, I fortunately didn't sit in a chair where we had to drop any sports, but very rarely does an AD go into a job saying, "Ooh, I can't wait to cut sports," right?
Yeah.
That's not something they do typically willingly, right? It's not really a choice that they choose to make. It's something that they are forced to make. So, going out and teeing off on your local administrator is probably not going to help anybody's cause. And I think Scotty Sentes hit the nail on the head of like, we got to show the world from a wrestling perspective how incredible our sport is and what it can bring to the table, right? There are a lot of great things about the sport of wrestling and what it can do. And I think we need to be singing those praises and make sure we're celebrating the wins that we do have. And I think that'll help us long term.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I really appreciate you coming on and chopping it up. Looking forward to seeing you back in the coaching chair this year.
Appreciate it.
Again, appreciate your knowledge on this subject as well, and good luck this year.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the time.